Ingeteam Power Technology. Power Grid Automation. Tutorials. Topic: Updating an INGEPAC firmware. In this video, we will learn how to update the firmware of an INGEPAC IED for both the EF and DA platforms. The firmware of the INGEPAC IEDs can be updated in several ways. From the USB port in the front panel, with the Energy Factory Suite tool, or via the web server of the IED. First, we will update the firmware of both an EFMD2 and a DAPT5 from their USB ports. For that, we will need to have an empty memory stick in which to save the firmware. The firmware cannot be loaded to any file in the pen drive, but to a folder named FW, which stands for firmware. Additionally, the memory stick needs to be of FAT32 type and have no partitions. As it can be seen with this DA, once the pen drive has been inserted into the USB 2.0 port, the IED will detect it and read its contents. Since it has been loaded with a firmware version in the proper folder, this IED, which has a display, will let the user choose between loading or ignoring the firmware. Once the procedure has started, the IED will download the firmware and tell the user to remove the pen drive. Then the display will show the status of the firmware update procedure. Additionally, the status LED of the IED will blink or turn red and green in accordance with the status of the update. When the firmware has been properly updated, the IED will first reboot, and then it will try to parse the CID that it previously had and check for incompatibilities between the CID and the new firmware. Much like DA IEDs, EF IEDs can also have their firmware updated with a memory stick. Once the pen drive is connected, the IED will detect it and its firmware file, and will let the user choose between updating it or not in case the IED has a local display. After choosing to update the firmware, the EF IED will also download it and tell the user to remove the pen drive. Then the update procedure will start, and the local display will show the current status of it. As soon as the firmware has been updated, the EF IEDs will also try to parse the CID they had. In this case, the loaded firmware version is not compatible with the local display configuration, which corresponds to higher firmware versions. In addition to firmware update via the USB port in the IDs, firmware versions can also be updated with the EFS tool. For that, we first need to open the PAC Factory application and access the installation's topology. Then, in the Configuration Toolbar tag, the Send Firmware tag will let the user establish an FTP connection to the IED. After that, a new window will pop up where the location of the firmware to be uploaded shall be browsed and selected. Finally, by clicking on the Update FW button, the firmware will be sent to the IED. The connection to the IED will be lost due to the firmware update. Thirdly, firmwares can also be uploaded to IEDs via their web server. In order to access the web server, we need to type the IED's IP address in the browser and log into it with the proper credentials. Then, in the SW Configuration tab, inside the Firmware section, different firmware versions shall be uploaded to the web client and sent to the IED. First, a firmware file needs to be chosen. For that, we will click on the Choose File button and browse on our computer to select it. The selected file will be uploaded to the web client, and the instructions to proceed with the firmware update will be shown to the user. Finally, clicking on the Update button will send the firmware file to the IED. The connection to the IED will be temporarily lost due to the update process. Once the firmware is fully updated, the connection shall be restored. In this case, the firmware of this DA IED has been downgraded from cybersecurity to no cybersecurity. Therefore, the default users are no longer the same. Finally, we now know how to update the firmware of an INGEPAC IED.
Ingeteam. Electrifying a sustainable future.